Hi, everybody. We're about to start. We're just waiting for the cameras to go live. Okay. And I think we are ready. So, okay, everybody. If you can hear me, please raise your hand. Thank you. All right, so I'd like to welcome everyone to Your Brain at Work, Science and Tips for Cultivating Well-Being in the Workplace. About 5,000 people around the world have signed up to watch this live stream, and we'd like to welcome you in your offices and homes and wherever you are. This is being brought to you live from the Mindful Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. We'd like to thank our partners, the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at University of Wisconsin and Mindful Magazine. Thank you for working with us to make this happen. And what I'd like to do now is introduce the three people who will be in conversation. Richard Davidson is a renowned neuroscientist. Very renowned. A renowned neuroscientist and one of the world's leading experts on the impact of contemplative practices such as meditation on the brain. He's the founder of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Golbie Kamarei is a corporate well-being and performance consultant, and she's the founder of the meditation program at the BlackRock Financial Services Company. And David Gellis is a business reporter for the New York Times and author of the book Mindful Work, How Meditation is Changing Business from the Inside Out. Thank you.
Are we okay? Oh, good. Welcome everyone here. We still have people trickling in the back of the room. And welcome everyone online as well.
Actually, David, excuse me. I just remembered. I'm sorry. I was supposed to make an announcement. So we're going to be live tweeting questions. So if our hashtag is #Mindful Summit. So whether you're here or you're anywhere out there watching with us, please feel free to tweet your questions, and we'll do a Q&A a little later on with those tweets. Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. So to reiterate, no questions from the audience at this session. Tweet your questions. Welcome everyone again. We're just at the beginning of the 2-day Mindful Leadership Summit here just outside Washington, D.C. And tremendous energy in the room, tremendous audience. And welcome everyone online as well. We've got a great second panel, and thank you all for, in the room at least, dealing with me for a second segment back to back. Let me briefly explain why. I told Mo and Eric I'd love to participate, but if we could concentrate my time as much as possible, I'd like to do that, because I have a 6-week-old baby boy back in New York who I'm desperate to get home and see. So I was happy to do it, but I'm eager to get home as well. With that, excited to have on stage two friends and real leaders in this field, Richie Davidson and Golbie Kamarei. Richie, I wonder if you could just set the scene. Earlier this morning, we heard from Bill George, a business leader, who essentially said that the research that you and colleagues have done over the last 30 or so years has really opened the door for broader mainstream acceptance of mindfulness, of meditation. Can you, in brief, summarize what do we now know? What do we now know about how meditation and mindfulness changes our bodies and our brains?
I appreciate the question. It's an important one. And let me first begin by saying, despite all of the wonderful enthusiasm, which I share, we actually know very little. And so I think it's a very healthy practice to engage in the practice of being honest and also not knowing. And so we know that when we scan the brains of very long-term practitioners, that their brains look different than the brains of age and gender-matched controls who haven't been meditating for that period of time. We know that in broad strokes, circuits that are important for the regulation of attention and circuits that are important for the regulation of emotion in the brain can change as a result of various kinds of contemplative training. We know that different forms of meditation practice are not the same and produce different effects. And I would say the final thing we know is that there may be some useful changes on what we call peripheral biology, biology below the neck, that may be influential for our physical health. But please pay special note to the many sort of vague and less than definitive ways in which I phrase that.
Absolutely, and I'm going to press you on some of those non-specific points later in the panel. But I think we can all agree that at least the appearance of broader understanding, of broader mainstream acceptance, has accelerated this movement, is part of the reason why we have hundreds of people here in the room and thousands of people online today. Bill said that some of that research was helping acceptance of these practices at places like Harvard Business School, Goldman Sachs. Golbie, you've been bringing these practices to other big American corporations, including BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager. Is the scientific component, is the fact that there is this research that Richie and others have built up, this kind of corpus of amazing, if totally not entirely conclusive, but intriguing studies, is that helping acceptance as you look to bring these practices to corporations?
Absolutely. There's a cohort of people that are still rather resistant to the practice around meditation or mindfulness. And the research opens the door. It depends, not everyone. There's some people for whom this resonates, and it resonates on a very human level. But for those who need a little bit of proof that the conversation is even worth having, sometimes having the data, having the fact that scientists like Richie and others are spending time and money and energy to uncover the benefits, it piques their curiosity, because a lot of these people come from very data-oriented, rational types of ways of living, and so science makes sense to them. So otherwise might feel really touchy-feely.
And tell the audience here and online exactly what you were able to create at BlackRock. Just in brief, give us a sense of what happened. And again, I'm a business reporter for the New York Times, so when I heard what BlackRock was doing, and then when I met Golbie, I found it just extraordinary that this, the largest financial services firm, largest asset manager, was taking mindfulness seriously and was putting resources behind it, was actually offering it to thousands of employees. I was stunned. What were you able to achieve there?
So in April 2013, I had just come back from a trip to an ashram that I like to visit. And on that trip, I decided, you know what, I'm going to share my practice. It's had such a big impact on me. And over the previous year and a half, every time I'd come back from a retreat, my colleagues would ask me about what I was learning and how I was applying it and integrating it into my everyday life. And so at the time, I had been the vice chair of our New York People and Culture Committee. So I went to them and I said, look, I'd like to sit once a week and open it up to anyone in New York City who wants to sit with me. And they said, yeah, that sounds reasonable. I checked with one person HR, make sure that was going to be okay.
And did they think you were going to sit at your desk, or what did you actually tell them you were doing?
Fair enough. I said, I'm going to get a conference room, and I'm going to show up, and I'm going to do my practice, and I'll introduce it to people in the way that I've learned it. And I'm still a student, and I'll always be a student. And I'll translate it in a language that I know that they'll understand, because I've worked with them for, at that point, it had been 6.5 years. I had grown up in that environment, so it resonated. The resistance, the language, it was intuitive for me. So we sent an email to the New York City office saying that we're offering guided meditations, and the tagline was to improve focus and attention, some language around that. And instantly, I think it was 60 people signed up to show up. And so the next week, I showed up, very excited to have, this part of me now actually live in my work life, and because before they were very separate. And 30 people showed up the following week, so that the first session, 30 people showed up. And it was a very new experience for most of the people there. And it resonated and it hit home. And so there were so many questions. So it started what became a much broader conversation at the firm around meditation, mindfulness, well-being, stress. And then the momentum just grew. And it grew mostly through word of mouth for probably the first 9 months or a year. And so 60 people as official members became 100, became 200, became 400. Someone in our Princeton office found out about it and said, hey, you know what, we want to participate. So I thought, okay, well, how do we do this? So let's book a conference room in Princeton at the same time we're booking it in New York, and they can dial in and just listen. And so we experimented with video conference, and that was too distracting, mostly for me. But then I was also really aware of my ego through all of this, and I thought, no, that's going to be about me. People don't need to look at me when they're meditating. They just might need a little bit of transition into the space and into their bodies and into the moment, and then they can, and then the practice is really about them. There's
Richie,
more to tell, but I see it seems like you want to ask a question.
Well, your mindfulness has made you very perceptive, Golbie.
I've always been a bit perceptive.
I want to hear how that program spread. But first, I just have to interject and ask what Richie's thinking as he hears about BlackRock kind of scaling up mindfulness. Richie's been doing this work, but largely, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you somewhat ostracized early in your career. You initially were told not to pursue the study of mindfulness and meditation because you'd never have a serious career. And here we are, steps from the Pentagon, learning about how mindfulness is taking off at BlackRock. Can you just step back and give us a little historical perspective? I mean, is this what you thought the natural evolution would be when you began this work 20, 25 years ago? Or are you kind of astounded?
I'm pretty blown away by how rapidly things have changed. I never would have imagined that we would be in the place we are at today. Bill, in the first session, alluded to the sessions that we've been holding at the World Economic Forum. I mean, that's not the place I anticipated speaking about this kind of work. I've spoken about this work at the World Bank with Jim Kim. It just unimaginable even a few years ago. And so I think that we are really close to an inflection point. And my vision is that mental exercise in 15 years from now, by 2030, will be regarded in the same way that physical exercise is today. And that mental exercise of the sort that we're talking about will become part of our weekly, if not daily routines. It'll be part of our personal hygiene in a certain critical way. And I think that the scientific research has certainly played a role in helping to nurture that along, but it has proceeded far more rapidly than I ever would have imagined. And I think in part it's because of the challenges that we're facing in our culture today, and I think the broad recognition that the way we've been doing things is just not sustainable, and there needs to be another framework.
I love that aspiration, though I fear that if mental exercise is viewed the same way physical exercise is, everyone will pay $90 a month and never go to the gym.
Well, if you actually look at the data, though, and compare the percentage of the population that engages in some physical exercise at least a few times a week, and compare that percentage in 1950 to what it is today, there is a big difference.
Agreed. You talk about that need, I mean, mental exercise, and it made me think of what Golbie said earlier. When you said it was about focus and attention, people showed up. Where is the need coming from, and how are people at these big companies actually responding to offerings that can address some of these deficiencies?
I think people are most responding from a place of trying to manage stress. In fact, I did a survey, and I have some of the results down here. I'll just peek down. So I did a survey in July of 2015 and one previously in July of 2014. In July of 2015, of this year, 77% of people who joined the program at BlackRock and who answered the survey said 77% said they wanted to reduce stress. 72 said they wanted to increase mental focus and attention. 69 wanted to learn techniques to build emotional awareness. and 64 wanted to experience health advantages. And some people just came because the person next to them said, come, show up. Most people, I mean, there's a lot of conversation about how are we framing meditation, mindfulness, and even, the label mind training, which is really seductive to people in the business world. How are we framing it to them? Are we somehow discrediting the integrity of this practice? And are we using it just for performance? And that conversation comes up as well in business. And I've never really had a big struggle with that debate because I've seen what's happened over 2 years with people who are incredibly performance and results oriented. That might get them to the room, but as soon as they're sitting there, even after one session, it becomes a different conversation. It becomes a conversation about connecting with parts of them that are more authentic. Becomes a conversation about taking care of their body. Becomes a conversation about intuition. And so some people at the margin might use this mind training or mental exercise for the application of increased performance and results. I've found it's more just a positive byproduct. It's never actually why they continue to stay with the practice.
Yeah, this notion of mindfulness is mindfulness somehow just being corrupted to be used at the service of profits.
Yeah.
It's out there, and I think it's worth discussing, but I'm always reminded of a line that Pam Weiss, who's a great mindfulness teacher and has worked with a lot of corporations, said when I spoke with her earlier this year, and she said, she's worked with Genentech, with Salesforce, she's been in these big corporations, and she said, I've never taught a company mindfulness. I've only taught people who happen to work at companies mindfulness. I think that's exactly the right orientation, and it's a reminder that this is a very individual experience, and that if as teachers, as advocates, we can remember to connect at that individual level, I think a lot of those concerns will take care of themselves. Richie, though, I want to talk to you about some of your more recent work, because what you're looking at and what you've discovered is changing, and changing quite rapidly. It's no longer just about the fact that there's maybe more gray matter in our prefrontal cortex. You're looking at a much more holistic set of potential outcomes. Resiliency, and I think this notion of resiliency is something that Golbie alluded to. That's what a lot of people are dealing with in companies. Working, whether it's in New York City at BlackRock or wherever you may be, it can be absolutely debilitating. Can you talk to us about some of your new work and what you're finding when it comes to mindfulness meditation and how that might increase resiliency?
Sure. Actually, to put it in a slightly larger framework, we've recently written about 4 neuroscientifically validated constituents of well-being. One of them is resilience. And resilience we define in a very specific way, and that is the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. The second constituent is in many ways the flip side of resilience, and then I can talk about these in a little bit more detail. It's an emotional style that I've talked about in other contexts that we call outlook, which is the ability to focus on the positive attributes of others and to savor and sustain certain kinds of positive experiences. The third constituent is attention. And simply put, a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And there's a wealth of evidence to support that. And the fourth constituent is generosity. Probably the most effective strategy for changing specific circuits in the brain that we know to be involved in well-being is through generosity. And so those 4 constituents all work together. Now, in terms of resilience, we've been able to actually measure in a very hard-nosed way how long it takes for certain circuits in the brain to come back down to baseline. And it turns out that some people, when they encounter life's slings and arrows, they show a response in the brain, and 2 people may show the same amplitude of response, but they may differ enormously in the rapidity with which they come back down to baseline. And so we have found that certain kinds of contemplative practices can facilitate the rapidity with which you come back down to baseline. But interestingly, our work suggests that that is one quality which takes thousands of hours of practice to actually show this change in the brain. It's not something that happens quickly. Other changes happen much more quickly. This is one kind of change that doesn't.
What happens more quickly? Because I know a lot of people, they're like, what's the minimum effective dose? How little can I do to make a difference?
Yeah, that's a question that I hear about, that I get all the time in America. You know, actually it doesn't take a lot to produce certain kinds of changes, and I think that it's very interesting. From all the work that we and others have done, my view is that compassion and loving kindness practices are practices where change can be observed much more quickly. So we published just